Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Just going to give people a couple more minutes. Kind of a late afternoon session. I know people are sort of probably running behind and trying to make their schedules work for them. So we'll give them a couple minutes before we start. Hello from Cold Lake, Dawn. Lovely to see you here. How are things in Cold Lake? Are you getting steaming hot weather like we are in Edmonton today? Are you getting hot weather today too, Jeremy?
Oh my God.
Yeah, probably even hotter than us and dry.
Don't get me started.
It's been insanely humid this year.
In Edmonton? I know. Yeah.
Which is so strange. Hello, Jacqueline. But I did get to go swimming this morning, so I'm a happy camper today.
Oh, God darn you. I still haven't.
It is so nice the way the city is doing it because you get the whole lane to yourself. So it's, I'm like, you know what? You guys can keep doing this forever because I quite like this setup.
That's just so unheard of in a city that size, honestly. Like, that's going to give people the wrong idea. I'm actually worried about that. They're going to start losing, lane swim etiquette skills, and it's going to become less normal to be.
I actually was thinking about that as I was swimming today because I'm swimming right down the middle of the lane, and I'm like, am I going to forget how to swim in a circle? So I have to go back.
Yeah.
Oh, well. All right. How many people? Okay, what time we have? We're going to wait 2 more minutes and then we will get started, folks. So will your pool be up and running again soon then?
Well, that depends on when the part gets here. It's like this swimming pool predates the Truman administration.
Well, same as ours. Yeah. We have a very old pool too. They did a big renovation a few years back, but they made so many errors it actually had to be completely redone.
Yeah.
Didn't use the proper, I don't know what the terminology is, but they ended up getting black mold in the whole building.
Oh no.
They used drywall material in a pool. Crazy, right?
Oh my gosh. So, yeah. Do you know what? You know the weird thing about swimming? I swear to God. So like, I did obviously triathlon and before I got a real job, right? And I was a puker in triathlon. Like nausea was a real big problem for me. Okay. But do you know what cures that nausea? Is swimming.
Really?
I don't know, yes. I don't know. Like without a fail, like you get prone in the water. I don't know if it's being prone or if it's the rhythmic.
Yeah.
The way like just floating up, and I don't know what it is, but something about that's just very soothing.
Even in a lake?
Yes,
like
even in a lake, but especially in a swimming pool.
Yeah.
Something that always relieved the nausea. It's odd, isn't it?
All right, folks, we're going to get started here. So welcome. If you haven't met us before, I am Heather Garreau Miller, and my cohort here today is Jeremy Parasini. He is our reconditioning specialist out of Suffield, Alberta. Suffield belongs to Edmonton as a satellite base when it comes to health promotion, so that's why I've joined forces with Jeremy because he's part of my team. And I am one of the health promotion specialists in Edmonton. Both Jeremy and I are kinesiologists. However, Jeremy is practicing kinesiology in his everyday, and I am a health promoter. So I'm really going to rely on his expertise as we go through these last 2 sessions together. So today we're talking about finding and maintaining neutral spine, and really specifically, for the most part, focusing that topic on physical activity and maintaining that neutral spine when you're under load during physical activity. So just to get us started, you guys, those of you that have been on our sessions, will know that we're going to give you this little caveat. Before we get started, the presentation you are about to view is the intellectual property of the Department of National Defense. Any reproduction or retransmission of the slides contained in this presentation is strictly forbidden. Some of the topics discussed in this webinar may be of a sensitive nature and may not be appropriate for children. Parental discretion is advised. Please understand that people's stories are theirs alone to tell, and anything that is shared by participants in this webinar, either on camera or on chat, is not to be discussed outside the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing later on the CAF Connection. That is happening quite quickly these days, so it's very easy to access them later on. Though active participation is encouraged, you may simply follow along without using the chat options if you prefer. Okay, so just finding out who our folks are that have joined us today. You can pop in your answers in our poll for us. This is just for our stats to make sure we're hitting a few. So we got we don't have any serving members today. Okay, just veteran, family member, and civilian employees today, Jeremy. So we might want to think about just how we're wording things. We'll have to keep that in mind. So thank you for that. All right, so today we are going to be talking about what is neutral position of the spine. Why does it even matter to us? And what are those postural deviations? So what are the postures that are outside of neutral spine that we typically would be seeing? Why does it even matter for us? What is the risk for us of being out of neutral spine during physical activity? And how do you find your own neutral spine? And lastly, we're going to talk about best practices for exercise when it comes to neutral spine. So if anybody has any ideas, we'd love for you to share. If you had to define what neutral spine is, how would you define that? And you can just put that in the chat if you like.
You know, I'm going to offer my answer to this. I'm going to offer, like, neutral spine is a conversation ending term. That's what it is.
It's like, oh, don't ask me that because I don't know how to answer that, right?
It's almost like if you claim the authority of neutral spine, then whatever point you're trying to make, you win. This is like the common perception. Okay?
Sure.
It's a scary term. It's meant to like scare people off.
And it's really not supposed to be complicated, but it maybe sounds like a technical term, and it is to some degree, but it's really, we're here to try to simplify that and make it easier for you.
I'd really like to, yeah. We
are going to start by showing you a video where this cruel professor or strength and conditioning coach asks all of his young athletes exactly what we just asked you, and they get just as terrified as maybe you did. Oh, Jeremy, shut off your mic.
Neutral spine. What do you think?
Just straight back, like flat the whole way.
Straight spine.
When your spine is straight.
So I know what it is, but it's hard to explain it.
Spine straight. When your back's straight and doesn't bend when you squat.
Like when your spine is just like it's straight, like stacked. Straight back, no curve.
No curve?
Or a little curve.
So straight is close, but it's not technically correct. Zoe, if you please.
So your spine has like natural curves in it to allow sort of like the weight of your body not to all be on the one place.
The spine has 4 natural curves. 2 lordotic, the cervical in your neck and the lumbar in your lower back, and 2 kyphotic, the thoracic through your rib cage and the sacral right down where your sacrum, your spine, meets your pelvis.
So it's like nest shaped the whole way.
A natural curve.
The way that your posture is normally. Not too far forward, not too far back, something along that line.
Keep it in that kind of, yeah, is that what we're talking about?
So you have like a flat spine or like a really exaggerated curve. It's like in the middle.
The grey between the black and the white. It's not too curved and not too straight, it's kind of like just right.
Neutral spine is where your back is in its natural position, so there's nothing like having extra stress on any singular part of the back, I guess.
that perfect curvature in each part of your spine so that nothing's too stretched or there's not too much weight on anything and you're nice and balanced.
The reason neutral spine is so important is when we load the spine with compression in exercises like
Squats,
College.
arabesques,
RDLs
step-ups.
And landings.
We want to distribute those forces evenly through the intervertebral discs.
Whenever you're doing an exercise or a squat, you're keeping yourself straight and you're not moving around.
Making sure that you don't arch back too far or tuck your pelvis in too far forward.
Or else you get pressure through your lower back, so you don't damage your discs in your back and like move them out of place if you're picking up too much weight.
So Ruby's hit the nail on the head there. When the spine's in neutral, all the vertebrae stack on top of each other, meaning when that force, that compressive load, when a compressive force is added to the spine, any force that goes through those discs will distribute evenly through the entire 360 degrees of the disc. When that spine is not neutral, particularly when it's flexed, it looks something more like this. And so now when it looks something more like that, when that rear disc wall is open, if you add compressive load like this, instead of the force being distributed evenly through the disc, it's going to send backwards to the rear end of the disc, stressing out that rear wall and accelerating the degenerative process in those discs.
That's why we squat with seats. Learned that last week. Thank you.
So we've got a golden rule in this gym. Get as low as you can whilst maintaining neutral.
And so we use seats to control depth on squats. And we use blocks to control the depth on our core lifting and our deadlift variations.
Which we adjust according to individual's mobility and control.
And why is it important?
Because it's how your spine wants to be. It's like its little happy place.
That happy place that Elle's talking about really applies to lifting and adding compression to the spine in exercises like squats, deadlifts and core lifts. They're the situations where you really want that spine to be neutral. In life and in sport, it's expected and it's normal that your spine goes through ranges of motion, whether it's flexion, rotation, extension. That's normal. It's when you add compressive or shearing force to that you're really accelerating the wear and tear on those discs, and particularly that rear wall of the disc, forcing that nucleus of the intervertebral disc rearward, stressing out the annulus. Now, this is the real reason why we do all our squatting and core lift work only to a depth that allows our athletes to maintain neutral. That doesn't mean we're afraid of flexion and afraid of motion, but what we do is we separate them out. So we do our heavy lifting in a neutral spine alignment, and then if we're going to add any flexion to the spine, we do it when the spine is unloaded in something that we call a ROM squat.
The point of the ROM squat is to get excellent range without the load. So we're chasing a good depth without any load on the spine. It gives us the ability to move well laterally and get down in our stance.
Do you want to talk about neutral spine now?
Really gonna make you do this?
Yeah, go on.
It's just when you have a straight spine. I don't know.
That's good enough?
Pretty good, yeah. Why is it important?
So you don't break your back. Pretty simple.
Heather, are you there?
Off screen for now.
Okay. Right, guys. Well, so that's almost our whole webinar in a nutshell, but we're going to parse a few things out, okay, that are especially important from, I don't know, not the Canadian perspective, but certainly from the perspective of force. Incidentally, our next workshop in the series is about what has more to do with the force evaluation specifically and how to train for good movement quality in it, okay? So that's going to closely relate to this, but unfortunately we don't have any serving members here today, but Okay, so what you're seeing on your screen right now is, well, to the far right, you're seeing the neutral spine. How do we know this is neutral? Well, look, it's that red line, midline, right? It's going through the ear, the top greater trochanter, so this leg bone and then knee and ankle. Anyway, neutral spine, okay? So if you could stand all day long and move through life in this posture, that would be ideal for your health, okay? But to the left of that, you're seeing 4 ways that this can go wrong, right? And that we can, experience accelerated wear patterns in the back. So we would categorize this as less healthy ways to go through life, and especially to move, right? So we're just going to, well, look, to the far left, what you're seeing there is it's possible there's a little bit of a flat back here. This is not an academic discussion, but categorizing things is often tricky because there's more than one thing happening at once. But so you're potentially seeing a little bit of a reduced curvature of the spine there, but of special note, what you're seeing far left. Well, look, if you look at the top, like the waistband of these shorts, so you notice that the top is so the forward section of the waistband is on top, the back is a little bit lowered, right? So if you think about like the pelvis inside this human being, the forward part of that pelvis is shifted up, the back part of the pelvis is shifted down. That's a postural term. It's valuable to understand what that's called. That is a posterior pelvic tilt, okay? And that's not great movement quality, what's happening right there. That is common. You see that in the elderly quite a bit. There's other categories this comes from. I think of this as being a result of the result of sort of like not using skeletal muscle very much, so underuse, okay? Anyway, so that's one type of bad posture there, okay? All right, so let's move now second from the left. So what is happening here is very obvious. This human being has a huge arch to the lower back area, right? This is what we call the lumbar area. That's the one with the lordotic shaped curve, right? And it's just highly accentuated here. Now, but also look at the top waistband of that man's shorts, right? So now it's the inverse of what you saw to the far left. Now the back part of the pelvis is elevated and the front part of the pelvis is lowered. And so we call this an anterior pelvic shift, okay? So where do we see this? Well, we often see this among endurance athletes, so like long distance runners. We also see it, interestingly enough, common from gymnasts, football players. I'm not sure why this is so common with pregnant women, and I'm even less sure how this happens so commonly among children, but for some reason it does. And aerobic participants, and aerobics, just another word for endurance sport. So I think, repetitive overuse causes this. There's some other causes that we're going to get to in a few minutes, but yeah, that's a hyperlordotic lumbar curve there. So hyper, just too much, lordotic, so too much lordotic in the lumbar area. Okay. Third from the left, we are seeing an example of a sway back. So the term there is sway back, right? Well, what's happening with sway back? Well, so that top arrow, which is connected to that man's mid back, look how that curve, this is a kyphotic shaped curve, so it's the inverse of the lordotic shape. This one's kyphotic, so kind of look maybe like a dowager's hump, this used to be called. Anyway, so we see maybe the pelvis being shifted a bit forward with this type of deviation, but we see the shoulders rounded of special note, and that mid back, it ends up curving outwards in that kyphotic shape to compensate. It's an example of a compensatory movement if you want to look at it that way. And that one is very common among not just older populations, but I think of this as being what tends to develop from underuse. So this is especially common among the sedentary. All right, and then fourth from the left it's also very obvious what's happening. This man's chin is all the way forward. Okay, so this is the cervical spine area, and this is a hyperlordotic cervical curve. So it's just, I think it's lordotic, it's that curve there, and it's just accentuated. It's much less than a 90-degree angle. It's too acute. Very common among the elderly. Okay, so as I say, 4 examples of how posture can go wrong on a chronic basis. And I thought that this was important to go over, however briefly, because it's very common. You know, you can find this stuff everywhere. You know, we'll say, well, you know, if you have a sway back, well, then these are exercises that will cure your sway back. And, you know, quick question whether or not exercise can cure sway back. It's very good at preventing it. It might be part of a cure. But putting that issue aside, I just think it's valuable to know just some basic terminology so that you can look for good preventive exercises. But also because this slide brings us closer to the meat of our presentation here today, which is about the physical fitness aspects. And so Heather, if we could move on to slide number 8. Right. So again, so what we really want you to walk away with generally here is how to behave like physical fitness to prevent back problems, perhaps to cure, but certainly to prevent, okay? So to talk about that, there's just some key terms that we have to go over, but I assure you nothing wonky here. We're gonna start with flexion and anti-flexion. So this may sound, don't be dissuaded, because honestly, these concepts are just dead easy, right? All right. So flexion is a great example. Like, so if you think about, well, everybody knows about biceps flexion. Like, look, there's actually a biceps muscle in the legs, but most people, when they say biceps, you know, they mean arm. That's biceps breaking, okay? So everybody knows that the action of the biceps breaking is to, it's to flex the elbow, right? When that muscle contracts and shortens, all other things being equal, it's bringing the hand towards the shoulder, right? So a force that, well, with respect to the arm, a force that pushes the hand close to the shoulder is a flexive force, okay? And so flexion is just an anatomical term. It's completely arbitrary, right? We've just defined these things one way or the other. We'll get to that. There's flexion in the spine too. Okay, so it's not just, flexion is not just a term that applies to the arm, but it applies to the spine. And Heather, if we could go to slide number 10, okay, I'm going to show you that slide, slide number 10, flexion of the spine. So to see flexion, if I could bring your eye to the lower row of images where you're seeing 2 sets of vertebral bodies that are drawn, okay? So the way that these are drawn right now is so that the front of the human being is towards the right of your screen and the back of the human being is towards the left of your screen, okay? So if you look on the right set of vertebral bodies, if you look towards the front of the human being, which is the right of your screen, you'll see that the gap between the vertebral bodies, it's elongated, and the gap towards the back of the human being is shortened, okay? So this is like the type of movement that occurs if you reach backwards. Like if you were to literally bend backwards, that would be an example of what you're seeing right here drawn. We call this spinal extension. That's just the name that's been given to it, okay? So it's when the back of the rear of the vertebral bodies are being pushed together and the front of the vertebral bodies pushed apart, okay? So the inverse of that is flexion, right? And so that's what you're seeing drawn on the left, right? It's a little bit harder to see it as it's drawn there, but if you look for it, you'll see that the rear of the vertebral bodies, they're being pushed apart, the front of the vertebral bodies, they're being pushed together. So, all right, so that is flexion and extension when it comes to the spine, and as intuition would suggest, a flexive force of the spine is one that is tending to force flexion or flexive movement, right, or create a flexive movement, and an extensive force is one that's going to create an extensive movement, all other things being equal. All right, so this is just terminology at this point. To go back to slide number 8, great. We have flexion and extension. But here's where it gets interesting, okay? Because if you think of biceps, the biceps in the arms, right? Its action is not the same as its purpose, or at least it's not the only purpose, right? Because if you think of how you use biceps through the course of your life from infancy to senescence, I would bet you that you're usually using biceps not to bring the hand towards the shoulder, but to stop the hand from dropping. Like when you're carrying a heavy object, for example, right? Which you'll see on your screen right now, the top row of images farthest to the right, right? So if this lady were to just stop working with her arm muscles, well, that box is just going to fall down. We call this extension of the elbow, right? But the important point is that biceps, in this sense of the word, really in this movement, biceps, its role is anti-extension, okay? Now we see another example of the inverse type, anti-flexion. I assure you this will make sense. Look, again, top row of your screen, second image from the left. So the woman in the blue top, right? She's hanging from, looks like a bench there, right? She's hanging her upper body from a bench, right? So if she were to just drop, like stop working, her lower body would fall towards the floor. Now, it's not happening because she's resisting that force. How is she resisting it? She's using the muscles of the lower back. They are contracting. They're not flexing, they're not extending. It's just anti-flexion that's happening there. That's an anti-flexion force, okay? So all that is just explaining what it means to say that that there is such a thing as flexion and extension in the spine, and there's such a thing as a flexive force and an extensive force, and there's such a thing as an anti-flexive force, and there's such a thing as an anti-extensive force. And in physical exercise, and you're seeing it right on your screen, anti-flexive and anti-extensive forces, they're everywhere, okay? And we're going to get in the next screen, which we'll get to very shortly, you'll understand why this is important. But before we move on to the next screen, just 4 more forces to just briefly cover. Very easy to understand. These ones are very straightforward, okay? So there's a compressive force. That's just what the name suggests. A compressive force is just pushing the vertebral bodies together. So Heather, if we could slide number 10, okay? Slide number 10, if you look at that top row of images, the compressive force is labeled as B. So it's straightforward. You're just looking at a spine in these images. You're looking at the spine from the rear of the human being to looking towards the front of the human being. These vertebral bodies are being pushed together. This would happen, for example, if you had a barbell across the shoulders. It's going to push the columns, the vertebral bodies together. All right. So we have compression, okay? And then we have traction. So traction is the inverse of compression. It's labeled as C in this diagram, okay? That leaves rotation. That's another force in movement. That's labeled as D, these vertebral bodies moving in a rotation type of movement, right? If you're curious, E is just another type of like flexion. It's call this like lateral flexion. It's not terribly important to this discussion. But last one we're going to cover is a very important word, but more important concept, and it's shearing. Okay, so if there's only one word you walk away with from this webinar, understand the word shearing. This is important. So this is labeled as A on the diagram, and you'll notice, like the directional arrows, these are vertebrae being pushed apart from each other in opposite ways. So in this image, it's one left, one right. It could have been one forwards and one backwards. That would also count as shearing. The important point is vertebral bodies being pushed apart. This is the recipe for a slip disc. Typically, when someone talks about a slip disc, this is basically what they are talking about, okay? All right, so that brings us, Heather, if we could go to slide number 9. Right. This is the cash value, what we've just gone over, okay? When it comes to all these forces and all these movements that we just discussed, okay, the spine, when it is not loaded externally, so this means like a dumbbell, barbell, a rubber band, okay, it copes with any one of these forces in isolation fairly well. In other words, if we don't combine a flexive force with a compressive force or an extensive force with a traction force, at least if we address each one of them on its own, all these potential movements and all these forces, the spine does fairly well. Potential exception is if you have a postural deviation, if you have a dowager's hump, right? But at least if you have a healthy spine or something approaching healthy, you should be able to tolerate any of these except for shearing. That is a movement that the spine doesn't do well with, even when you're not loaded externally, okay? So, but now especially important for physical exercise, let's talk about what happens if you are loading up your spine with weight, if you are using dumbbells and barbells and bands and all that. Well, now a flexive force, that's one we have to be careful about. In other words, if you cannot maintain a neutral spine while you're carrying the load, if to carry the load you have to flex the spine, that's a potential issue. Okay? Same thing goes for extension. Same thing goes for rotation. Okay? And the same thing especially goes for shearing. Okay? Shearing, whether or not you're loaded, is definitely one that you want to be very careful about from a physical fitness perspective. Okay? All right. So that brings us to slide number 11. Unless you want to say anything else. Heather, did I miss anything important about any of that so far?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So we're actually going to get Jeremy to stand up at this point. So I'm going to close the slideshow just so that he's a little bigger for us. And Jeremy's just going to take us through neutral spine. I'll talk you through it, and he'll show us what it's going to look like. So you remember Jeremy was talking about that anterior or posterior pelvic tilt, or that tilting of the pelvis front and back. So if Jeremy, if you could just kind of show us that from the front, or from the side, what that might look like if you were tilted anterior and posterior.
Sure, just give me a second.
We'll go to the bar after. That way it'll be a little bit easier.
All right, so I'll just exaggerate it so that it's very obvious,
yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll show you the waistband of my shorts here. So a posterior pelvic tilt would be like this.
Okay, which we see quite often in people that are inexperienced in the weight room. And then the opposite of that would be the anterior tilt that was more shown in the picture that he was talking about, where you're seeing a lot of that lordotic type of posture happening. So what we're aiming for when we're looking for neutral spine is neither of those. We want to be right in the middle of that. And I tend to get clients to sort of do a little bit of an anterior and posterior tilt and sort of find that neutral zone that's in the middle so that they're standing nice and tall. Because if they don't know what that feels like, it can feel strange at first.
Yeah.
It might seem odd for those of you that have good posture, but if you don't, and you do have that tilt, then it's going to feel a little bit different. So what Jeremy's doing is he's taking his FMS pole, or you could take a broomstick, and this would be a great exercise for you to try at home. And he's making sure he has a 3-point contact on his back. So he's making sure that his head is in contact with that pole, his upper back is in contact with the pole, and his gluteus maximus is in contact with the pole. So he's got buttocks, upper back, and head all touching the pole. Now, if you can do this, you are in neutral spine. Now, here's the key, though. Can you do it when you go into a hip hinge, which you might do when you were doing a squat or you're doing a deadlift? We want to be able to maintain that same posture. So Jeremy's just going to do a forward tilt, hip hinge, and see if he can maintain that. Now, just because he's a kinesiologist doesn't mean that he's perfect at this, because we all have our weaknesses.
That comes off.
Yeah, so don't expect perfection from us. Just because we teach it doesn't mean that it's always easy for us. Jeremy's a runner, so remember that first picture, and he was talking about a lot of endurance athletes struggle with that lordotic posture, and that can be an issue for us regardless of our skill set. But it's a great place to start to see how you're doing. Can you maintain that 3-point contact with a pole and do a forward bend or a hip hinge, as we refer to it, from the hips?
Are we on slide number 12 now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Back up. There you go.
Yeah. So just don't misunderstand how important that one key word that Heather used was. What she said, like, this is a way of learning what it feels like to be in a neutral spine. It's different from knowing it theoretically, okay, or even seeing it. Like this, like using a stick like we just did, it doesn't have to be anything fancy like this, but just using some physical, like some tactile surface, right? just to get the feel like, oh, I wasn't aware that in my case, like my mid back is like falling away, right? And so that like then, which the way you use it is you're trying to memorize what it felt like to maintain that point of contact that you were losing. Like that's how you're going to build potentially like the motor skill that you're trying to build, which is to maintain your neutral spine, right? Okay. So we are going to talk about the neutral spine. Well, we already talked about the neutral spine in standing, okay? And in our last slide, we briefly covered like a hip hinge, right? And so don't let that term, scare you at all. Like hip hinging, again, it's like this type of movement in the spine. Okay, we would call this hip hinging, right? So where are you going to do hip hinging? We see that a lot in a deadlift. Okay, so deadlift, which I am going to have bad technique in, so that'll help you learn these concepts. I'm doing this special for you. A hip hinge, right? So you start in a standing position with your 3 points of contact. So that's, for me, that's my head, mid back, and my sacrum. Okay, so that's like between the gluteus maximus, right? All right. So from there, better yet if you have a mirror, but even if you don't, just focusing on maintaining those 3 points of contact as you descend into your deadlift and up. Okay? That's about as much as I can do for the moment while maintaining good posture. Okay? So that is one movement, one exercise that you can do for hip hinging. And then we have quadruped. So let's cover that one next. I'm going to move this laptop over. So quadruped, that just means on all four. So this is going to be a balancing act. Right? Head, mid back, lower back. Firstly, standing position. Okay? So you might find yourself in this position to start with, and it's not going to balance on your back. So first thing is you're going to feel that spine already, it's going to feel different. If that was you and you couldn't even get into this posture, this is going to feel weird. The movements, the flexion that you have to do in order to balance that. So that's like, that is hard enough for a lot of us, I assure you, right? Especially the non-superhumans. But then if you wanted to introduce even more complexity to it, okay, try maintaining those 3 points of contact while you're moving. And now you're really getting a sense for where your problems lie, because for me, as you saw, it was coming back down to the resting position where my back arched and everything kind of went to hell, right, to use a scientific term.
And this is a hard exercise to do without somebody to stand off to the side. So if you want to try this at home, highly recommend having a buddy around that can sort of navigate that pull for you to see if you can keep it in place.
Yeah, yeah. All right, what's the next one I should do, Heather?
Okay.
Oh, is it your turn?
Yeah, it's my turn.
All right.
Are you glad to take a break?
Okay.
All right. Sorry, guys. I'm back here. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about what are some of the things that could put you at increased risk for a spinal loading injury. And these are some of the very classic things that we see. Typically we're seeing, as Jeremy said, if you're lifting a load and you can't maintain that neutral spine and you end up in flexion, there's a very high likelihood then what's happened is in this first picture of this fella with that very heavy barbell over his head, he likely hasn't done the appropriate amount of progressive adaptation to allow him to lift that weight. Is he at some point in his life going to be capable of that? most likely if he approaches it wisely. So starting with increments that you can maintain that neutral posture and be able to move through the movement that you're wanting to with a neutral posture. The second one is lifting while outside of that neutral zone. So you're seeing this fella doing his deadlift, and you can see the rounding through the low back that's happening with this fella, and he hasn't maintained any scapular setting through his shoulders, which is also causing some rounding through his thoracic spine. So if you're lifting like that, especially under load, you're going to be at much higher risk. The other side of that neutral zone was where Jeremy sort of has a little bit of issues, and you saw that with his quadruped, and that's with the lordosis a little bit. So you see this lady in the second picture doing her squat there. And many of us might say, wow, that looks like a really good squat. But in fact, she is actually out of her neutral spine in this squat and has a lot of lordosis going on. So she has that anterior pelvic tilt that we were talking about earlier. So we want her to come back to more of that neutral spine. The third reason that you might end up with risk of injury, and many of us have probably experienced this, I know I have, especially living in Canada, any kind of rapid or uncontrolled movement. So the first thing I thought of when I thought of that was slipping on ice, which has probably happened to every one of us when we've lived in this country long enough. So when that happens unexpectedly and we're trying to regain our balance, we have this uncontrolled rapid movement, and that can often cause injuries to happen. Now, one that maybe people don't think of, especially when they're younger, is when you first get up in the morning. So you've been laying in the same position for a long period of time, and that back becomes very stiff, and it requires some slow, gentle movement to get us moving again. So lifting and bending first thing in the morning could put you at high risk for an injury, because your back, just plain and simple, to put it in simple terms, isn't awake yet. It just needs a little bit of time to get it moving. And then we think about twisting and lifting at the same time. This is a major cause of injury for us. So not only does this fella lifting the box in his hard hat there, not only is he lifting with a non-neutral spine, but he's also having a rotation at the same time. So that's going to put him at even higher risk. And then we talk about mobility. So do you have poor back mobility, particularly your lumbar mobility? Are you quite stiff? And you can see this picture of this lady. She can't really get into a nice curved spine. It sort of flattens out through the lower back or the lumbar spine. So if that individual was to work on their lumbar mobility, they likely would put the, gain a little bit of risk adherence there. And then we talk about anti-vibration. So if you work with any equipment that has or that exposure to it, we want to think about doing that in very small amounts. So 15 minutes is usually the recommended amount of time that you're doing it. And then thinking about also having a good posture. It's a little bit hard to tell in this picture if our construction worker here is in a good neutral spine. It's a little hard to tell from this position. She looks like she could be, might be a little bit of a hump going on in the thoracic, but not really clear. But if you do work with vibration, the two pieces would be make sure you're in neutral spine and limit the amount of exposure to that. So about 15-minute segments at the most. And then just fatigue, plain and simple fatigue. And I have been guilty of this myself. I will start doing something around the house. I'll be, planting a garden or cleaning the house, and I want to get it done. But my body is telling me I'm sore, I'm tired, I really should be taking a rest. But I got about 20 more minutes. I'm just going to finish it. And that's when we put ourselves at really high risk, when our muscles are already in their completely fatigued state and we keep pushing them past their capacities. Yes, Dawn, thank you. Yeah, I've done it so many times. Power washing my deck. I've ended up sort of laid up for a week because my back was telling me it's time to quit, but I didn't want to quit because I was almost done. And yeah, almost put me out for another a week and a half just from cleaning my house or cleaning my yard. It seems kind of silly, right? So thinking about that, if you have to break it up. It's well worth it to have it broken up over a couple of days or hand it off to somebody else that lives in your house to finish up the work instead of hurting yourself. And then the last one, I really think probably one of the biggest things that many of us are facing today is prolonged sitting. So we are losing a lot of the muscles that help us to have good posture because we are spending so much time in a seated position. And just a lot of times when we are sitting, we don't have good posture. And so that is going to decrease our mobility and our ability to get into a neutral spine will become impaired by that. So thinking about all of those pieces, but really thinking about how much time am I sitting down? So many of us are facing that today. I know for me, and even more so now that I'm sitting behind a computer and talking to you this way. I used to be in a classroom and talking to you. Now I'm sitting here talking to you. So it's taken away even more opportunities for me to be in a standing position by having to be in a virtual platform with you. But I'm still happy to be here.
Okay. Well, so what we're getting to in this slide here is a little bit of review, but special emphasis on some fundamental, like the aspects of this webinar with the highest cash value, okay? So everything that we've just discussed is a way of saying that when it comes to how you're behaving for your physical fitness, like in a gym, okay, using dumbbells and all that, right? All right, the way to approach moving is to first, well, the way to approach your physical fitness is to first learn to do whatever it is that, whatever movement it is that you're talking about, be it a squat or a deadlift, okay, be it running even potentially. The way to approach that is to first learn to do the movement without any external load. This includes rubber bands, right? And if you want to split hairs, this could include certain types of posture, right? Like hanging your lower or hanging your upper body from like a glute ham developer or hanging your upper body from a bench. This could be considered an external load, right? Anyway, first thing to do is to learn how to do the movement well. Second thing to do is to do it under an external load. And by the way, that video that you saw at the beginning of our webinar, we saw some of those kids doing squats. And I don't know the word they use for it, but sometimes these are referred to as props. Like, so if you put a physical barrier that's going to disable you from moving below a certain range, okay, that is another way of doing this, of learning to move well first. Is, you know, you might call this biofeedback. The point is to put something, to situate something so that you're getting a signal when you have moved lower than you intended to do. This is another way of learning to move well before you move to move a lot and to move with a lot of force, okay? All right. Another note on that is that it's actually not just the quantity of external load that is also something you want to learn, that is an important distinction, right? It's also the amount of reps, it's the amount of sets that you're doing that could also put you into more of an overload than your spine can take. Okay, so in other words, that is another variable that you need to control. If maintaining neutral spine is a problem for you, it's not just the amount of resistance that you're using, it's also the amount of reps, the amount of sets, the amount of rest that you're doing. Okay, all right. And another best practice from a physical exercise perspective, well, there's this movement activation, which I think we talked about in some earlier episode. Movement activation, you could accuse me of using a fancy word. I'm really not trying to. Movement activation, it's like, this is doing specific types of movements, typically before your main workout, like as a preparatory thing, right? Doing certain types of movements that we know will activate the muscle groups that are responsible for good quality movement. So I know that in earlier episodes we covered like the lateral rotator group, muscles that are deep inside the pelvis. They control the position of the femur inside the hip socket. They don't produce a lot of force. They just control that position. So if we covered like some movement activation, it's like that just we know activates those muscles. All right, well, same thing translates, like same thing goes for the spine, right? So especially when it comes to the scapula, as an example. So on your screen right now, I could draw your eye to the upper right box. So this one with the enumerated 1, 2, 3, 4, okay? I think they call these ITWY. Sometimes you refer to this movement activation referred to as doing like ITWYs. This is movement activation. This is activating the muscles in and around the scapula that are going to keep that stable, but also give it sufficient mobility. So to do this movement activation, as you're seeing on your screen right here, you'd lie prone, you hold your arms in the I position. And by the way, you're not going to get the full effect of this. You're not going to really feel like the way this exercise works unless you actually try it prone. But yeah, just to briefly run through it, and then hold your arms out in the T, bend your elbows, that's a W, and then Y, okay? So that's one example. And then just before we move on to the next slide, quickly, what you're seeing in the bottom right, okay? So a few names you can attach to this, but like a glute bridge typically is what this is used for. And yeah, so in slide 7, we talked about a anterior pelvic tilt, right? So that's the one that sort of looked like this. Okay, it's associated with a hyperlordotic lumbar curve, right? Well, look, like this is movement activation. This is activating the hip extensors. Hip extensors in this case, we think of them, all other things being equal, as correcting that that anterior pelvic tilt. Okay, so that's movement activation that might be remediative, certainly preventive, if you have like a lumbar curve problem. Okay. And I don't know if we want to cover this one.
No,
after all.
What I would like to do, I'm just going to close the presentation for a second, is I have a couple of questions from our audience that I'll pose for you here, Jeremy. So Dawn is asking, when I'm weeding the garden, I have a hard time maintaining a neutral spine. I inevitably end up hunched over in almost a C. How can I position myself to prevent that?
Well, I might be able to end run the problem, because if you're talking about being hunched over in a C, I assume you are standing, right? You're standing and you're bending over at your waist, right? And have you considered going like quadruped, like on all four? Is that possible? Is she in the chat? I can't see the chat.
She hasn't answered yet. One second. Yeah.
So that's one way. Okay. No, you might accuse me of cheating, because that's sort of end running the problem, right? But if you're finding that you're rounding in your back, is she answering right now?
She says she has a raised bed up about 2 feet. So my first initial thought would be maybe sitting on a stool for her.
It's another way of end running it, though, right? Right? Because I think what she's getting at is like, how do you train your back?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you train your mid back to not be hyper like kyphotic?
Yes,
case, right?
yes, that's what she wants to know.
Yeah. And okay, well, I don't mean to be politically correct, but I must say that, like, depending on the severity of this problem, that this could be not to put too fine a point, but could be a medical problem, right? Like, this could need physical therapy, right? Which I don't do, right? But I would say that this rounding of the back, to the extent that is a kyphotic type issue, right? This is a failure of your mid back to, like, the muscles in your mid back to resist the stress that's on them, right? Might help with that is the ITWY movement activation that we just talked about. Again, this may or may not cure it entirely, but this is definitely something to try. Okay, that could prevent the problem. But then the other thing is, which we also sort of covered, is to not overdo it, right? Because like, it's unlikely that your mid back is excessively kyphotic the whole time you're doing your gardening. Like, more than likely what's happening here is, as you're getting fatigued, your body's compensating. This is how it's compensating, right? So that is a way of saying that you might need to take breaks more often, and you might need to build up your tolerance to the movement. Like, I know this is definitely true of myself. Like, I'm way more, at least I think I'm moving way, but I do a lot of landscaping too. But just as the season goes on, like late August, I have just better tolerance than I did in May, right? See what I'm saying?
And our second question, Jeremy, is very similar in posture, but different circumstances. So Anne is asking, I am tall and I find counters and tables and pretty much every surface is too low, so I hunch my shoulders a lot.
Okay. So she's really tall, and so she's finding that to work on an average counter, she's hunched over. Okay. That's another, well, if you want to refer back to slide number 7, okay, I don't know if you can show that on the screen right now, but if what you're describing is, so reading back, so far left is 1, and then 1 over is 2, and then 1 over is 3. You're probably describing either 3 or 4, probably 3, right? So you see he's hunched over a lot, right? So again, like, not to be repetitive, but if this is what is happening, again, like ITWY, if you actually try this movement, like try it prone, like, and get the feel for it, it's forcing those muscles, like they're deep inside. This is not your lats, this is not primarily your traps, right? These are small guys that are underneath other layers of muscle. It's forcing them to do their job. What is their job here? It's, well, if you see that rounding of his mid back, it's when these muscles contract and shorten, they're correcting for that. They're pushing it back. But the other thing is, if you're really tall, okay, then I wouldn't be, and you're bending over a lot, I wouldn't be surprised if you could be seeing a little bit of what you're seeing in posture number 2 there, right? So this is where his, what we call this an anterior pelvic tilt. Okay, so this is where the back of that man's pelvis is higher than the front of his pelvis. So if you could, what corrections for this would involve contraction or at least tightness of the hip extensors. Okay, so this is the muscle group that is in the back of the legs. It's between the buttocks and the knee. So I might suggest as a long-term strategy, what might help you with this, like, just have better posture given your height and given what the movement it is you're describing, it would be training your hip extensors to be more active. So this would be, for example, this would be like a lying hamstring curl. Okay, that would be like a textbook example of activating your hip extensors. And this can be done like unilaterally, so one leg at a time, or bilaterally. It can be done seated as well as standing. And actually a leg press might be, like, that's not your best exercise for developing or for activating this muscle group, but it's probably better than some others that I could think of. Heather, do you have any ideas on this one?
Well, I think one of the things that I think of right away when I'm seeing both of Dawn and Anne's comments, coming back to what you're saying about us spending too much time in that position, you know, inevitably we are going to end up in postures that aren't great for us at some points in our day. And I think that that's normal and it's natural, but it's how long we spend there that really becomes problematic. And when you're tall like Anne, you may find yourself in those positions more, which means you probably need more breaks than the shorties like me that are only 5'2" and the counter is more than high for me. So I don't find myself in that position. So where I might normally be saying to somebody, take a break every hour, for someone like Anne, maybe it's taking a break and doing some of those postural adjustments like Jeremy was saying with the I's, T's, Y's, and W's, might be something you're doing every half hour just to remind your body and to start to strengthen those upper back muscles a little bit to tolerate some of that. But the good thing about both of those situations you're talking about, depending on how aggressive that weeding is there, Dawn, is that neither of you are under load. So the risk of a disc injury is probably low. It's more going to be soft tissue that you're going to be dealing with that's going to be aggravated and annoyed by the movement that you're kind of forcing it to do. Does that make sense, Jeremy?
Yeah, and look, we're running out of time, but there's other ways that you can really make your life a lot harder. If, like, I'm talking about the lady who's like tall, like,
yeah.
For example, wearing heels, not just like when you're doing dishes, right? But like, this is something you want to avoid generally in your life for some reasons that we don't have time to fully go into here, but yeah.
definitely some things you can do though. Working on that mobility is going to be key for both of those situations. I think is going to be very beneficial. And those I's, T's, and Y's would be a definitely good place for both of you to start and see how you feel. But if the pain doesn't go away, remember that what we're doing here is education and not therapy, and it may be wise to go and seek the advice from a physiotherapist. Yes, absolutely. You know, it comes back, and Anne's talking about wearing orthopedic shoes all the time, and they help. You know, it comes back to a topic we did a couple of weeks ago about compensatory movement. And we don't think of those feet as a problem with the back, but we are one big kinetic chain. And when one thing is going wrong in the body, it's going to affect that entire kinetic chain. So dealing with the feet can often alleviate things far up the kinetic chain for us. So definitely wisdom is in having those orthopedic shoes with you as often as you can, for sure. So we are out of time. I just wanted to touch on the resources. You guys have probably seen them many times over, but if you're struggling with something along these lines, there's lots of resources that are available to you. Although today's topic is about IRS, and if you're struggling with some of those pieces, we have our dfit.ca website that can offer a lot of advice on training, but also using the resources that are readily available to you in your own communities can be very beneficial. We're very lucky to live in Canada where we have great healthcare, so make sure you're taking advantage of that to its fullest degree. Sometimes going and seeing a physiotherapist when you have a nagging pain might be 1 or 2 appointments just to get you back on track before you have a significant injury that's now going to take you much longer to recover from. So leaving you today with our only poll left, and that's just to find out if we were able to share some good wisdom with you today. Awesome. Thank you very much, folks. All right, so we have one more session next week, and although it may not apply to you, you are part of our community. You're always welcome to join us, but we are going to be talking about movement quality for the force evaluation. So if you have loved ones that are serving, maybe tap them into what we're doing in 2 weeks on the 10th.
Oh, not just that. Honestly, like, again, it's a force evaluation, but like human movement is human movement.
Yes.
There's no human movement in the force evaluation that is unique to the force evaluation. And the specific movements that we're focusing on is heavy lifting. Okay, so lifting objects from, especially lifting heavy objects from floor to sort of like hip or between hip and shoulder height. Heavy emphasis on that. And so, look, we're all doing this like throughout our daily lives. So just because you're not currently in the military, it doesn't mean you're not going to find anything in that workshop for you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for joining us today, guys. We'll talk to you all very soon. Hopefully you'll be back in 2 weeks. Remember, we don't have one next week, but it's the following week, and it is our final session at 3 o'clock Mountain Standard Time on Monday the 10th. All right, Jeremy, so we'll talk to you soon. We'll get planning our last session together.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.